Iran has been rocked by demonstrations as women protest the oppressive laws they're subject to. The immediate spark for the unrest was the death in custody of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, who was arrested by the morality police for not wearing the hijab appropriately. In response, women have been publicly burning their hijabs. There have been protests in at least 15 cities, with official sources saying that 7 people have so far been killed. Tara Saperi-Farr from Human Rights Watch spoke to Channel 4 News about the significance of the protests.
I think the significance of these protests is because it is happening in demands for accountability for this other woman and about a women's rights issue that has become the center of political debate. It is a very rare moment. I can't recall protests at this scale in demand for women's rights and dignity in recent years, certainly in the past decade.
And just give us a sense of how dangerous it is for women to protest in this way.
Women have been protesting in various ways over the past 40 years by merely living their life, by thriving in higher education, by attempting to have equal rights in employment, by leaving the house and choosing what they wear. But they have become bolder and bolder and more loud in choosing what they want and expressing it in the street. Taking off a headscarf in public can be punished legally, but also over the past 3 or 4 years, authorities have been trying to trump up charges against people who peacefully protest, accusing them of a connection to foreign forces, sometimes handing out prison sentences of several years. This shows an act of defiance and reclaiming of agency, and it's led by women, but it's good to see that it's not only women who are coming out to the street. Men and people from different backgrounds are accompanying them.
I'm joined now by Iskander Sadeghi, a lecturer in political theory at Goldsmiths University, and Mitra Yousefi, a PhD candidate in social economics at Hamburg University. Iskander, I want to start with you. Can you give us a sense of how widespread these protests are?
The protest did pretty much very swiftly as soon as pictures of Mahsa Amini were actually broadcast online and then obviously kind of lit social media alight. There were immediately sort of protests seen actually at the hospital where she was being held. And those quickly, obviously there's news of her actually death spread. There were further protests actually in her hometown of Saqqez in Iranian Kurdistan. And then they've just been spreading and spreading and spreading. And it's just been quite remarkable to watch. Everywhere from Rasht in the north of Iran to even places like Zahedan in the southeast of the country, which is generally, often people would say, is rather conservative. You see them sort of engulfing the country as a whole. Another really important point, which I think that the clip that you just broadcast actually made, which I think is a really, really important one, is that obviously women are very much at the forefront of this, but it is also men very much sort of taking a secondary role and really confronting security forces, as are women. And it's really quite remarkable to see. It's sort of what we're seeing in many ways is sort of like a fear barrier has been broken through. And I really do struggle to find a precedent in that respect. And I just think that, it's testament to the fact that people really have reached in many ways the end of their tether. And not only that, I mean, obviously, I forgot to actually mention this. Mahsa Amini came from obviously the Kurdistan region. But I think the reason why we're seeing them on such a widespread scale is because they speak to really universal concerns. There's sort of systemic discrimination and violence and gendered violence against women, which is something which is day in, day out, people experience throughout the entirety of the country. So this is why it's resonated with so many men and women, because I'm sure obviously women do experience this. First and foremost, they experience the brunt of it. But many men, of course, have experienced, a sister, a cousin, an aunt, and so on, who have been detained in this horrible way, demeaning, humiliated, and then basically criminalized. for simply wearing improper attire. So that's why I think it really has hit a nerve. And especially with this new generation of people, many people who don't even remember, for instance, the reformist period and so on, they really have only experienced disappointments and sort of systemic crisis, whether it's on the economic front, whether it's on the political front. And they really have begun to see that women's rights and claiming them and, forcing, really forcing their way to the forefront of the sort of the political struggle is essential to any kind of deeper democratic transformation in Iran as well.
Mitra, I want to get your thoughts on, I suppose, the context of this. If you could sort of explain to our audience the nature of the oppression of women in the Iranian Republic. What is the background here? Obviously, there is an immediate event, which is the death of this person in police custody, the death of this woman in police custody, but it's speaking to much, much larger and broader discontent.
It's a system of humiliation. Since 1979 revolution, the policing and control of women's bodies have begun. And since then, the Iranian government has been exerting control over what women have to wear, how they have to behave, what their role in the society is. This goes from school to university and is deeply engraved in how the state is actually operating. This mandatory Islamization of all spheres of social life, reducing the role of women into motherhood, discrimination against LGBTQ people, the legal system that deprives women of their basic rights, and mandating legal code adhering to Sharia law are all examples of discrimination against women in Iran. According to Global Gender Gap Reports 2017, Iran ranks 140 of 144 countries for gender parity. Compared to other South Asian regions, women in Iran have better access to education. But when you look at the female labor force participation rate, the average value is 14%, while the world average is 50%. I would like to emphasize that all these discriminations and lack of self-determination reflect the position of women in a hierarchy of a system that is based on clientelism, corruption, and appropriation of the total surplus value.
Iskandar, I wanted to bring you in on this question. I suppose the source of these patriarchal laws, is there a popular element to this? Is this the case that there are loads of Iranian men who think, oh, we love having power over women, let's keep these patriarchal laws, and so there's support for them? Or is this a top-down thing? Is this because Iran is not a democracy, and so thereby there are elites who can impose this kind of things on the population?
I think definitely the ruling Islamist system certainly did manipulate and sort of draw on deeper kind of patriarchal currents and traditions within Iranian society. And definitely, in order to basically consolidating itself and consolidating this really kind of deeply ingrained, as Mitra was saying, institutionalized form of gendered social control certainly did play into that. But I think it is important, as Mitra was saying, there was always resistance to this. I mean, I think just saying this didn't just come out of nowhere. Obviously, there's a slightly qualitative difference in the form of resistance today, but it certainly has always existed. When we go back to March 1979, the revolution happened in February 1979. Women very quickly mobilized against mandatory hijab. And it's also just important. I mean, my main focus is really as a historian. So one thing that we do really see, even in 79, very few people who participated in the revolution, who witnessed what was called the Spring of Freedom, thought that mandatory hijab was really ever on the cards. What we actually see that it was very much led from the top. Ayatollah Khomeini famously, at the very beginning of quite early in the revolution, did say that women who work in government ministries will have to wear the hijab. And women rapidly mobilized on International Women's Day of 1979 to reject that, and really forcefully. And when we look back to their struggle, it is actually, they were very much like a bellwether, a barometer of what was to come. And unfortunately, they were shut down and repressed. And then there was obviously a counter-revolutionary kind of backlash, mobilization, in order to ensure that no such initiative would ever be launched again. But I would just like to read two of the slogans of that period, which I think are very, very indicative of how many women sort of both viewed the revolution and participated in the revolution and saw their struggle for women's rights as part and parcel of that struggle against the Shah's dictatorship. So one of them is we did not make a revolution to go backwards. And that was said, by masses of women, thousands of women protesting mandatory hijab. Another one was freedom is not Eastern, not Western, it is universal. So this goes to say, one of the things that one might hear is that this is sort of an indigenous tradition. This is what most people want and so on. This is their way of doing things. Huge swaths of Iranian women absolutely rejected that. And I would say that many religious women also reject mandatory state-enforced hijab, which necessarily requires state violence to be enforced. And this is exactly what happened to Mahsa Amini, that she really bared the brunt of state violence. And this led to her, as far as we understand, led to her death. But like I said, women have been resisting ever since. And even in the dark day in the 1980s, through the 1990s, there was a 1 million women signature campaign, and so on and so forth. So, I think that is a very, very important history. This is sort of the latest chapter in it, and it is a really ferocious one, and it's quite incredible to see.
Mitra, I want your assessment of how people in the West, and I suppose especially I'm talking about left-wingers, leftists in the West, respond to protests like this. Because there is, an understandable suspicion, basically dating back especially to the Iraq War, where people see neoconservatives and right-wingers saying, we need to have some quite aggressive foreign policy towards a country like Iran to save women there. I think that makes left-wingers suspicious of protests like this, potentially reluctant to engage, to even, I suppose, bother to have an opinion on it because it's a bit too complicated. What do you make of that question? How should people look to protests for, e.g., in this case, women's rights in countries like Iran, which we know are subject to imperial ambitions of Western powers?
It's true that Western countries cynically talk about women's rights, fund and pursue NGOization of social movements, and thus corporatize the protests, etc. Yet at the same time that the right is on the right, they are trying to channel the protest and impose their discourse, slogans, etc. There we see a growing sensitivity towards such attempts. Just look at the slogans that we hear on the streets against monarchy. Just look at the slogans that highlights the justice, freedom alongside opposing mandatory hijab. Just look at the slogan of Jin Jian Azadi, or woman life freedom, which originated in the Kurdish movement in Rojava, which finds its way into streets of Tehran. These are the signs of hope that people in the streets are demanding equality and freedom, which could promise an alternative future beyond the plots of humanitarian interventions and so on that you mentioned, and beyond the imperialist plots of bringing monarchy back to Iran. The legacy of Iraq war, as you said, teaches us that we leftists across the world have to show solidarity and inform ourselves about the ongoing struggles on the streets, and not let the vacuum to be filled by the reactionary forces that have ruined this region in the first place.